this part of the show is typically where we do Nissan news,
Mhm.
and this is where Miles and I we each scour the internet for some of the latest Nissan articles or articles of interest related to Nissan, Datsun, Infinity, and they come from both either the Nissan official newsroom or from media outlets at large. I'll got the first one, Miles. If you want, that's cool with you. I'm
Yeah,
going.
tear it
I'll
up.
kick it off. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'll share my screen on this one, guys. Of course, as we always do. So what I wanted to share this episode is more of a history lesson, and honestly, it was news to me. I really didn't think of it or know of it before. So if it was news to me, hey, I wanted to share it with you guys. But what they're talking about here, this article came from classicmotorsports.com. They're talking about a 240Z Datsun 240Z record holder at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. These records were set in the 70s, at least at that time, record holder. But what makes this story unique and great to me was that, when you think of Datsun and Z car, especially in the 70s, they had just come out. And I mean, I think at that time, Datsuns were widely known as just being an affordable car. When you think of the 510s and the Roadsters, economical, because this is also probably you're getting into the gas crisis era. You
Mhm.
know, it's not very. I don't think it was very common to think of speed record holder when you thought of Datsun at that time, and much less in a straight line. Even today, when I think of Datsun, or if I asked maybe most people with Datsun, they might say, um, a canyon cruiser. You go out some curvy roads, you have a good time in a nice classic car. So, what I liked about it so much was that we're talking about Bonneville Salt Flat record holder Datsun Z cars.
Mhm.
So that's what this article is about. And let me see if I can share some photos on this one. I'm gonna go ahead and scroll down and share a few photos as we go. But just to give you guys a little bit of a history lesson, though, this 240Z was a chassis that was used and tweaked by multiple and tweaked with multiple iterations between 1972 and 1976, and raced and setting records again at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. This chassis, this particular Z car, went through multiple owners. First owned by Racer Brown, and he was a famous race car camshaft grinder who essentially broke records with this car by reaching. Think about it. Again, this is in 1972. 152 miles an hour for this class. Of course, we know cars can go faster even then, but for again in competition, you have different classes. So for I believe it was the F class, 152.134 miles an hour was a record that it set, and I believe it did it with the original 2.4 liter inline six engine. Of course, eventually, what you saw happen though is that this chassis was then handed or sold over to Nissan USA volunteers. They were
Mhm.
led by Bob Stockman, who got their hands on it.
Right.
And over the next couple of years, literally, this is um, you might call it a Nissan backed program.
Yeah,
Essentially,
the tech
uh,
center actually. At that time, Nissan had a tech center, and the
mhm,
tech center employees all got it. And I know this vehicle well because I actually talked to a guy named Jaffe who ended up
yes,
owning this car years. Sorry, I apologize. I don't mean to steer your thunder, but
no,
yeah, it was a technical group of guys that actually put it together. The gentleman on the far right, I think
hmm
that's Stockman, if I remember correctly, and
okay,
I I lose names for the rest of those, but I remember like Tom O'Connor was another guy that was involved. And I'm going off of
yep,
memory here, so if I get anybody's name wrong, I do apologize. But I remember Stockman was the guy at the end, and
mhm.
I heard a couple funny stories about him getting in and out of the car, like as far as them adjusting and stuff. But I won't go into that to bleed out time here. But yeah,
Yeah.
it was an adopted thing at that time for them to put it. There's a lot of history in the car. I'm glad you talked about it, but I didn't want to steal focus. But please continue.
No, all good, man. But yes, like you said, man. Essentially, uh, oh, where was it at here? This was essentially a Nissan backed program at the time. Again, like you said, Bob Stockman was the lead, and he was also the driver for
Mhm.
most of these
Yeah.
record setting attempts here. Um, these volunteers, Nissan employees, were handed a $5,000 budget essentially each year that it owned that car. And of course, the program essentially ended in '76. I actually looked this up because I was like, $5,000, what is that really? So $5,000 in today's money was actually about, or sorry, $5,000 back then was like $26,000 today. So if it gives you a better perspective of the budget that they were given for this car to go and attempt to break these records, that's a rather, you know, I think a healthy budget. I mean, I think, um, essentially though, this chassis continued to break its class records, ultimately reaching 166.37 miles per hour in 1976. And for those who know the Bonneville Salt Flats and how they come up uh, with that time that's set, it's not like it's a peak one time reached. It's actually an average of 3 runs along the way. There's a whole setup to it. So this was not just a one time thing. This was an average. So Bob, though, in this article recalls, and I'll scroll down a little bit more too. Tom O'Connor, like he did say. Um, Bob recalls that there were actually um, owners and racers in an E-Type Jaguar and also a 300 SL Mercedes. They said they were so pissed off that the Z went so fast. When you think about it, speed per dollar, of course, like I said earlier, Datsun, and at least from the perspective I've had, is that it was the economical alternative to a sports car in the '70s. And so you got these guys in Mercedes and Jags, and they're just you know, surprised, shocked, and pissed. It's just that how could this car actually go, um, that fast? So, um,
Well,
the
if I may, I mean, you got a bunch of Nissan, you got an entire Nissan technician center behind you. They're
mhm.
going to kick some ass. I mean, let's just call it
Yeah,
what it is. These guys are innovators. And to be honest, I mean, let's look at the aerodynamic design of this car to begin with.
mhm.
From a stock perspective, it's already a very good design. And then they're just going to come through, slap a Geno's on it, modify it, and God knows whatever else they did on this car to streamline it, and then drop the center, and then go from there.
Mhm.
It's I mean, come on,
Oh,
these guys were gonna they were gonna come out and kick some tail. They did
mhm.
surprisingly better than they anticipated. So
Yeah. So, as far as the last records that they were set, though, the last record actually beat the Mercedes Gullwing, in which apparently was in the same class, by 13 miles an hour. That's how much faster it was. For reference, 13 miles an hour faster on an average top speed than a Mercedes Gullwing. That record, again, at 166.37 miles per hour, actually would hold the record for 9 years. It wasn't until the mid '80s that that record was broken by a Ferrari. So to see a Datsun, outshine Jags and Mercedes, and then just barely, they said the record was barely beaten by a Ferrari 9 years later. I really goes, I think, is a really accolade that Nissan and this factory effort did so well. I really want to let people know this. Again, I didn't know this, and so I really enjoyed this article. Um, Now that's the first half of the story. So what's happening now is that after 1976, Nissan never returned to the Salt Flats in any fashion as a full-on factory effort. Although we do know that there are a lot of private teams who will use a Datsun or a Nissan or Infiniti, but it was never Nissan specifically. This chassis specifically has sat it sat at the Lane Motor Museum in Tennessee for nearly 50 years. It was just collecting dust. It wasn't until about 2020, like you said earlier, Miles, we know him as a renowned Z car owner and fanatic, Randy Jaffe. He was able to take possession of this car And with the assistance of Rob Fuller at Datsun Z Car Garage in California, they were able to recondition this car, restore this car back into its former glory. I think at that time when that car was received, the original engine that was used to set those records was no longer in the car. I believe there was a race. I think as of right now, actually, I'll get some more pictures here. That's Randy Jaffe and Rob Fuller there with the car now as it is behind them. And its current glory, they said it took 60 hours of detailed time to get the car kind of back
Damn.
to its original kind of restoration phase.
With something that historic, it's like you really kind of have to like, when we're talking like paint restoration, and there are some actual avid painters on here, so I'll kind of watch what I say, and then maybe they want to kind of chime in and correct me. But it really is like you have to take everything off in like really low layers. You're like, I'm not going to start with 1,000 on this. I'm going to really take my time in detail, and then really get into all, because you start dancing with the idea like I can't take this away or clean it up because this wasn't the way that it historically it was, like,
Yeah.
like adjusting jams and things like that. Like, you have to leave it the way it was. You're really just kind of going in and polishing the historical aspect of the car.
Yeah.
You're making
And,
it clean and detailed, and so
and
it's something you have to wrestle with as somebody that's trying to preserve history, or bring the brilliance back
yeah.
to something this historic.
That's true, and that's actually something that's really kind of cool for those who know uh, Randy Jaffe too. Is that this is not his first Datsun restoration. He has a handful, I mean, tons of other Nissan Z cars. Essentially, his private collection is a museum on its own, and a lot of them are tribute cars. But what he's known for what he's done in the past is, as part of a restoration that he has, he will find uh, some of the original parts that were used in a racing car and purchase them and put them in the car. So not only are you seeing a restored version, but it's still retaining character, and it's actually like these um I don't want to say souvenirs, but like these timeless pieces. A lot of these components that are in his cars have a story of their own. Where'd you get that steering wheel from? I'll give you an example. This car here, the steering wheel of this car was used in essentially was used in the 432 Datsun. The Datsun where you had the 2-liter dual
Mhm.
cam that was used in the early Skylines. This particular chassis number, when you go back to the factory, uh, according to records here, were tweaked. A certain number of chassis. This was one of them, as far as being lighter. You might even say a thinner metal is what they mentioned here in the article. But the steering wheel alone was from a 432 edition Datsun Z car. The seats as well. These bucket seats were from a 432 Datsun as well. Also, in this picture particularly too, if you look at the door jams, you know the car is being maroon with the stars and all. In the door jams, you see orange, and the reason behind that orange overspray, it's not overspray, maybe a previous layer of paint, is because remember where I was talking about the previous owner being Racer Brown. Uh, Owning this car before. Well, the car was originally orange at that point. And so that orange is sort of retaining that livery of what the car was in a previous life, which is a story. So it's I don't want to call them Easter eggs, but it's like if you ask why something is specifically this way in this car, Randy would be the type of guy that tells you everything about that car. Um, it really is an amazing build, though, too. Again, this is through classicmotorsports.com. We're going to put the notes in this article in our show notes. You can read more about it. Again, not only is this a really cool history lesson about this car and Datsun setting speed records, but it is also a story of redemption, where you see this car that set all these records and essentially collected dust for nearly 50 years, only to be brought back into its former glory by a dedicated Z enthusiast. It really is a beautiful story, though, and that's what I really wanted to share with you, um, as this article, though, Miles. I'm glad you know so much about it. I didn't know you knew as much about it as you did.
I know about it because I've talked to Jaffe, and this was years ago, about that car, and
Hmm.
it was just kind of one of those things where we talked about it in passing. And I had for a time, I had a small obsession with Bonneville Z's, running, especially like some of the early Datsun stuff, and then of course, getting into when they were getting really competitive with the 300ZX. So I just kind of had you know, this fanboy crush on some of them, and there's just a cool factor that goes along with that, And so I knew that he was one of the owners, so I had an opportunity to kind of chat with him. It's been some time. I can't even recall. Again, it's probably at a Z convention for my historical recollection. So yeah,
I see.
I did want to say George chimed in here and he said exactly right when you were talking about Dawson's on the scene,
Hmm.
with doing the Bonneville that time. So he said exactly right, guys. He goes, I was around when the Z first came out. We didn't know what to make of it. And basically, is this Z um, car for real? And he goes, well, it was, and it is, to this day. And I would kind of agree.
Yeah.
At that time, it was extremely groundbreaking, and the aerodynamics, be it whatever they were at the time, for style,
Hmm.
it lent itself to an extremely aerodynamic vehicle at that time,
Hmm.
which turned out to be extremely competitive.
Yeah.
So,
So, one thing before we move on, though, Miles, is that when I think about this effort and the records that were set with this car, it reminds me of what the Safari Z did in the
hmm,
South. Was it the
yep,
South Africa rally,
yeah.
African rally, where you know s- I think they're similar in some ways, but also different. Like for example, this was sort of like, oh, hey, we got here's a minimal budget. Go have fun. Employees on their off time. Nissan employees on their off time did this. Didn't really know what to expect. And here we go. They are setting records that held for nearly a decade. And then you
Yeah.
get into like what the Safari Z was like, which was I
Well,
don't
that
think they
was to
really
really kind
expected.
of the Safari entry was really to kind of get the Datsun name out there. I mean, they were dumping
Yeah.
these, and this is like they were in it before the S30 kind of jumped in, and then here they are. They dropped the S30, and it just turns out to be this amazing machine that just sets a huge mile marker with being competitive and doing extremely well in those settings
Hmm.
in that day and the age. And that particular race, in my opinion, from a global perspective, really kind of it put the Datsun on the map. It put that
Hmm.
that Z on the map, and it made Nissan really kind of a celebrity overnight at that time. So
And it makes Datsun more versatile. Again, from a rally perspective, which is an endurance race in high heat and rough terrain,
yeah,
to get it into a Salt Flats high speed record, which is a very American thing, I think, right? Top speed, straight line. So you see this versatility that
it
the
was the
Datsun Z
time.
is capable of.
Yeah. At the time, I mean, everybody was chasing speed, and you okay. And I'm going to nerd out here
Go
for a
for
couple
it. Go
different
for it.
seconds. So, at that time in the history of the United States, I mean, we were coming off of everything from rubber shortages to oil shortages, and you had a bunch of people that wanted power, that wanted to show off the power that, and then the hot rodding scene was kind of coming around, and then the low riding scene was kind of coming around. We're talking, this is probably 15 years before the Datsun S30 even kind of was there. So the setting of everything was there. Indy was starting to take off. NASCAR was, in the infancy of its roots. All those things were like perfect, and speed and power were really in the American culture at that time. And the drivability and the endurance aspect was very much on a global setting, which it kind of still is to this day. People are still thinking rally and everything else, and there's a lot of differences in cultures when you start talking about placement of countries and things like that. But
Hmm.
one thing that kind of reigns true in at least in the American culture, it's always been like, how fast can you go? And it's either like how fast can you go in a particular setting, in a 1/8 or a 1/4.
Yeah.
And then from there, it just said, well, screw it. How fast can you go as a whole. And then you had these like races that kind of came around, and the Salt back in the day was its own world.
Yeah.
And I nerded out on that culture for a really long time too as well. And the custom culture and the Bonneville Salt Flats were at a certain point married, and then a few years later, Datsun had an opportunity to try its hand at it, and here you are. And that's why people, people don't really know the importance of that car, and I'm glad you had an opportunity to kind of talk about it in this setting. So